On May 5th, 16-year-old Marfa Goloviznina was on her way from Zanek to her grandmother's house in Chulia. She chose a shortcut through the gloomy and grim swamps in the forest. A narrow path winds among the bushes and bogs. In some places, the path is covered by short logs, like a primitive walkway. Between them, you immediately sink into mud up to your knees. The puddles are black as tar, with rusty stains in some places, as if there's blood in them. Among the swamps, the girl saw a man lying face down on the path, wearing bast shoes and a kaftan with a knapsack. The edge of his clothing was thrown over his head, and the man turned out to be just sleeping. The girl took him for a drunkard and walked on. But when she returned the same way on May 6, everything was different. The body was lying in the same place, but now someone had removed the coat, and it was clear that the person had no head. There was a gaping wound on the neck. Marfa ran home in a panic, and her father reported it to the authorities. This happened in 1992. Today we have an unusual case with an unexpected plot twist. It's literally a prehistoric true crime. Compare how things were back then and how they are now. April 1892, Russian Empire, the village of Stary Multan. A Russian boy went into the hut of his friend Udmurt to play, and overheard the adults discussing recent natural disasters in the province. Either they didn't notice the child sitting behind the stove, or they didn't know that the boy understood Udmurt. The guest overheard a very strange and creepy conversation. One of the adults said that he had a dream in which many people fell into a terrible abyss. The frightened people promised God to make any sacrifice for their salvation, and then a path appeared before them, leading out of the abyss to light and abundance. The Udmurts gathered in the hut decided that such a dream meant that God was displeased and was sending misfortunes upon people because of their weak faith. And that means they needed to hold a prayer ceremony with the proper ritual sacrifice. And since God was so displeased, they shouldn't spare the ritual blood. In the early 1890s, the Vyatka province was struck by disasters. First a crop failure, then a typhus epidemic. The situation was difficult, but the village of Stary Multan was almost unaffected. There was no typhus there at all, and hunger affected only a few families. The village was mostly inhabited by Udmurts, who were then called Vatyaks. The neighboring villages of Anik and Chulia were mostly Russian. There the situation was difficult, and starving people, in their desperation, looked for someone to blame and quarreled with the Udmurts over land that had miraculously escaped crop failure and the epidemic. And on May 6, a girl named Marfa found a headless corpse. The police officer reached the body only on May 8, and the bailiff arrived only on the 10th. All this time, the body was left unguarded. The examination showed that the head had been separated while the person was still alive, and a blood clot was stuck in the trachea. The victim's shoes were clean, which indicated that he hadn't come here by himself. He had been brought. There was neither the head nor any blood near the body. In the bag, they found a certificate with the name Konan Dmitrievich Matyunin, a peasant from the Kazan province. For some reason, Bailiff Timofeev did not leave the body in the village of Anik, but ordered it to be taken to Stary Multan to the Udmurts. This caused confusion, since formerly the body was found on the territory of Anik. But there was an explanation. The Udmurts themselves approached the police official and tried to show him traces of blood at the scene, but he regarded their behavior with suspicion. Perhaps he was influenced by the Russian peasants' talk that the Udmurts had preserved the custom of silencing a person, of sacrificing people to the gods. The investigator paid no attention at all to the oddities with the dead man's clothing. When the girl was walking along the path on May 5th, the body was lying face down, with its face in the ground, and the kaftan was thrown over it, as if the person had covered himself or someone had covered him after death. The face was not visible. She thought it was just a drunk man who had fallen asleep in the forest. The next day, on May 6th, she took the same road back. The body was still there, but now the kaftan was gone. It turns out that someone had approached the dead man, examined him, maybe touched him, maybe searched his pockets. Who? It remained a mystery. During that time, the police hadn't sent anyone there. The girl finally told the adults that there was a headless man lying on the path. While they waited for the constable, peasants from both villages arrived and trampled all around. There were no traces left. It wasn't clear whether the body had been dragged along the ground, where it had been brought from, whether he was killed at that spot or dumped there. When the constable arrived at the scene, the body was still lying in the same place. But now the kaftan was no longer on the body. It had been neatly folded by him behind the straps of the knapsack. Someone, even after the girl had left and after the peasants had trampled around, had come up to the body again. What were they doing? They turned the body over, hid something. Why did they touch the dead person again? Then, a couple of days later, the bailiff arrived and found more changes. Now the kaftan was put back on, and not just thrown over, but the arms were put through the sleeves. The knapsack was on top. It was as if someone was dressing the dead man like he was alive. The best shoes were also tied, but poorly, as if they were putting them on cold, limp feet. There were no udmurts in the area back then. None of the locals admitted to coming near. So, while the body was lying on the path, someone kept coming back to it again and again. He would take off the kaftan, put it behind the bag, then take it out again and put it back on the dead man. All of this without explanation. Why? Whether it was to confuse the investigation or, on the contrary, to hide traces of his actions was unclear, especially since the district police officer and the investigators didn't pay much attention to any of this. They were only interested in the poorly tied bast shoes. The fact that someone had changed the body's clothes, moved it, and returned to it several times was simply ignored. Although that could have been the key to solving the mystery. In the end, the body was brought to Old Multan, where the locals dug a pit and threw in ice and snow. The deceased was wrapped in a mat and covered with earth, with guards posted nearby. That was their version of a morgue refrigerator back then. But in May, it was difficult to preserve a body without a refrigerator. The locals complained about the smell. The body was dug up and reburied several times. They laid down boards to avoid damage. Then one of the boards collapsed. Konan Machunin's body lay in a pit with ice for almost a month. Because of the epidemic, all the doctors were busy. There was no one to send for an examination. When a doctor finally made it to the village and performed the autopsy, everyone was shocked. The head was separated while the heart was still beating. A blood clot got stuck in the throat like a cork. But that wasn't all. The chest was also cut open, deeply, with force. It immediately became clear. This was much more terrifying than just a beheading. The chest was chopped open with an axe or something similar. It wouldn't have been possible with just one blow. They chopped along the ribs, the collarbone, and the dense back muscles. The marks from the weapon were confident and precise, as if the person knew exactly where and how to strike. But the most horrifying thing was that it was empty inside. No heart, no lungs. They weren't just damaged, they were removed. Carefully, skillfully. As if someone had deliberately pulled the edges of the wound apart, took out everything they needed, and then closed it up again. Even the shirt was still in place. If the body had already stiffened by that time, the edges wouldn't have closed back together. That means the organs were removed shortly after the attack, at most within 10 to 12 hours, so someone acted quickly and precisely. And clearly not in the forest in a hurry, but somewhere secluded, where no one would interfere. Why did they take out the heart? Why wasn't the head found? Back then, everyone decided it wasn't just an attack, it was a sacrifice, supposedly according to an ancient pagan ritual, but no one looked for any evidence. From the very beginning, they decided that the Udmurts tortured a Russian. Meanwhile, law enforcement started an investigation. One of the interrogations was conducted with 90-year-old Andrei Grigoriev. He was paralyzed and said that he never left his house, had never been a shaman, and had never engaged in any rituals. In the village, there really were so-called clan huts where the Udmurts made offerings to the spirits of their ancestors. In Old Multan, there were 2 such huts for different clans. In each, they found dishes with traces of blood, feathers, and fur. In both huts, Christian icons stood in a place of honor. The police confiscated the dishes from the clan huts, bowls, basins, and dishes with dried blood and bird feathers, even though, in fact, they proved little. You could find things like that in any peasant household. All of it was added to the case as material evidence. The dishes were presented together in court. To confirm that the bowls contained human blood, someone recalled a folk method. If a dog won't lick it, then it's human. Naturally, the dog didn't start licking the dried blood that was 5 months old. Veterinarians and doctors explained that the method isn't scientific and doesn't prove anything, but the investigation continued to believe in the dog's squeamishness as evidence. All the items were declared sacrificial utensils. However, the examination showed that the blood was of animal origin, and the hair was fur from domestic animals. Despite this, the items were kept among the evidence to be shown to the jury at the trial. These pieces of evidence had no legal force, but they could make the desired impression. By this time, several residents of Old Multan had already been arrested. Moisey Dmitriev, the owner of one of the shalafs, 90-year-old Andrei Grigoriev, Semyon Krasnov, Onji Ivanov, Vasily Kondratyev, and the butcher Kuzma Samsonov. The latter was considered an executioner, as he often slaughtered cattle. Investigators assumed that he could have also taken Matyunin's life. There was no evidence, but suspicions were enough. Dmitriev's wife, who allegedly helped her husband take out the body, for some reason was left alone. Before arresting Dmitriev, the police questioned two local madmen, Mikhail Titov and Konstantin Moiseyev. They were put in the basement, intimidated and beaten. They managed to get a statement from Moiseyev. He remembered how the village headman, Semyon Krasny, once led a certain vagabond through the village. That man supposedly stopped at the house of the day watchman, Kondratyev. That was enough to arrest both Krasnov and Kondratyev. And Titov in turn gave up his nephew, saying that he treats people with herbs, which means he's a shaman and therefore dangerous. After that, both fools were released. They had played their part. At the same time, Dmitriev's dishes and clothes were being examined. There were brown stains on his bag. Only later did it turn out that it was berry juice, not blood. But even after that, Moisey Dmitriev remained under arrest. The investigators refused to admit their mistake. Instead, they conducted another search in the hut, collected more dishes with traces of old blood, and once again added all this to the case. Time was passing, but there was no evidence. Then the police decided to use planted informants. Local Udmurts were placed with the prisoners to eavesdrop on a confession, but they didn't learn anything new. Even so, the police, in the Russian Empire by the way, the police were actually called the police, kept insisting, there is a case, there are crimes, and here are the accused. Meanwhile, the district police constable was replaced. The new one, Zhukov, behaved differently. He didn't make any sudden moves and acted friendly. But this friendliness turned out to be only on the surface. One day, he asked the wealthy peasant Vasily Kuznetsov to lend him 10 rubles. A respected man is asking for a small amount for a uniform. How could you refuse? A few days later, the policeman came to Vasily again and asked to borrow 15 rubles. The peasant was surprised. You haven't paid back the 10 rubles yet, and immediately became a suspect. The offended policeman remembered that Kuznetsov was on night duty on May 4th. This automatically made him a potential witness or participant. Kuznetsov was arrested. What's remarkable is that he was not only Russian, but also the head of the Orthodox community. It's quite strange to see him among those accused of an allegedly pagan ritual. The local priest, who had known Kuznetsov for many years, was shocked. He went to Zhukov and tried to explain that the Udmurts had been Christians for a long time, that the rumors were just prejudices, and that no one had ever seen any human sacrifices. But the priest wasn't even officially questioned. Because of these doubts about the police methods, the priest lost his position. A new priest was sent to the village, young and obedient to the authorities. He didn't see anything criminal in the Udmurt people's festivities on the edge of the forest, but he did provide the investigators with a useful detail. Among the dancers was an elderly woman, Kuznetsov's mother. That was enough to accuse the son of insincerity in his faith. The investigation continued to build its own version. According to it, this is how everything happened. On the night of May 4th to 5th, 1892, Vasily Kuznetsov met the beggar Konan Matyunin on the outskirts of the village. He took him to the village where the other suspects fed the poor man, gave him vodka, and let him spend the night. Moisey Dmitriev was informed that a suitable vagabond for the ritual had come to the village, and he organized the sacrifice. At this point, another person, Mikhail Kobilin, got involved in the case. he lived in Stary Multan and quickly found common ground with the new policeman, Zhukov. Soon he began telling frightening stories. Supposedly the Udmurts sacrifice a foal every year to the evil spirit Kurbon, and once every 40 years they sacrifice a person. It must be someone of a different faith. They burn the heart and lungs and separate the head. Kobilin claimed that he learned this from some Udmurt vagabond he drank with about 10 years ago. He didn't remember the name or where he was from. Mikhail Kobilin was made the main witness for the prosecution. Only later it turned out that he had a personal conflict with the residents of Stary Multan. A year before the incident, he was caught stealing grain. Kobilin secretly kept part of the communal supplies for himself, and when the Udmurts complained to the authorities, he was forced to return everything and pass it off as a mistake. But his relationship with the neighbors was ruined forever. The investigators, however, decided to ignore this conflict. Moreover, they began actively questioning people in the neighboring villages to reconstruct Matyunin's route. It turned out that he left his native village on April 20th and walked more than 100 kilometers on foot. On May 3, he spent the night in the village of Kuznirka at Timofey Sanikov's place. There he showed his passport and said that he suffered from epilepsy. On the night of May 4 to 5, he most likely also stayed with the Sanikovs, this time at the house of their son Nikolai, and that's when contradictions began to appear. The elder Sanikov remembered that Matyunin had a large blue patch on his kaftan, but the younger one did not. Investigator Rayevsky, seizing on this discrepancy, put forward a theory. That means there were two different beggars. One was Matyunin, the other was an unknown person. The testimonies of the residents of Old Multan were also divided. Some saw a beggar with a blue patch, some saw a drunk, some saw someone with a hand-rolled cigarette. All of this could fit Matyunin's description, but it also might not. The fact is that none of the witnesses could identify him specifically. Everything was based on guesses and coincidences. Konan Matyunin was not just a vagabond. He suffered from epilepsy. In those days, that was considered a sentence. He couldn't work in the fields or in the forge. Seizures could strike at any moment. That's why in spring and summer he would leave his homeland to wander and beg for alms, like thousands of other destitute and sick people. He carried with him a certificate, a confirmation of his diagnosis, issued by the district hospital. For people like him, it was something like a disability ID, so that the villagers, seeing a strong, seemingly healthy man, wouldn't look away with suspicion, and with the certificate they would give a little. He looked too much like those who pretend, not those who truly suffer. The doctors offered him surgery in Kazan. Back then, they still believed that epilepsy could be cured by trepanning the skull. Matyunin refused. He was afraid. He preferred to live with seizures rather than with a hole in his head. He was generally cautious. He didn't drink or smoke. After drinking and smoking, he would have severe attacks. He knew this and was careful. But when they started collecting testimonies in Old Multan, these facts were ignored. Is that even possible? A vagabond who wasn't a teetotaler? Eyewitnesses said that on the evening of May 4th, they saw a drunken beggar with a hand-rolled cigarette in the village. He was dirty, with a dull look in his eyes, barely able to stand on his feet. They claimed it was the same person who was later found dead in the forest. But Konan didn't smoke or drink. He would have had a seizure. It was someone else. Nevertheless, the investigation decided that it was indeed Konan Matyunin who came to Multan on May 4th. That was enough to keep insisting on the theory of a ritual killing. Although it would have been much more logical to admit that the person simply didn't make it to the village and lost his life on the way, for example, to a random robber. Moreover, if there really were two similar strangers in the region that night, it would not have been difficult to identify the second one. The province was under quarantine, all roads were guarded and documents were checked, but no one tried to look for the second beggar. Instead, the investigation deliberately ignored all the facts that did not fit the constructed narrative. All efforts were focused on reinforcing the already shaky theory of a ritual killing. People were accused not on the basis of facts, but on assumptions, guesses, and rumors. And the accused themselves spent months in prison not knowing exactly what they were being accused of or why. By the fall of 1992, the situation in the case had taken an openly absurd turn. The investigation had already accumulated 11 detainees, but there was no direct evidence against any of them. The decisive stage began in October. Investigator for especially important cases Yelizarov arrived in Vyatka. He was convinced that he was uncovering not just an attack on a beggar, but a crime connected to remnants of paganism. Yelizarov did not come to seek the truth, but to confirm a hypothesis. Even before analyzing the facts, he took the side of the prosecution. In the eyes of the authorities, the Multan case had already become a symbol of the struggle between civilization and savagery. It was hard to give up such a beautiful metaphor, so the support for the prosecution came from the top. The main task was not just to prove the guilt of each of the arrested, but to confirm the very fact of its existence, of human sacrifices among the Udmurt community. That was the essence of the case. It was not so much about taking Matyunin's life as it was about the political and cultural context. To prove that in the heart of Russia, in an empire that prided itself on its enlightened governance, there were still people living who performed pagan rituals. For this reason, the prosecution did everything to portray the Udmurts as exotic and backward. Evidence that was not legally admissible was collected in order to provoke disgust and fear in the jurors. After 2 years of investigation, the first trial in the Multan case began. The Udmurts were accused of ritually taking the life of a Russian peasant, Konan Matyunin. The investigation revolved around a single idea. The Votyaks allegedly sacrificed him to their gods. The case involved huts, cups, and supposedly blood-stained objects. Prosecutor Rayevsky spoke about a certain terrifying ritual. The chosen person is lured into the village, kept locked up, then taken to the clan hut, hanged, beheaded, the heart is cut out, and the organs are burned on a bonfire. He spoke confidently, passionately, as if he had witnessed it himself. The story made an impression on the peasant jurors from neighboring villages. 7 out of the 11 defendants were found guilty. They were sentenced to hard labor and exile. Only 3, the most inconspicuous ones, were acquitted. The prosecution won at first glance. But the whole case was falling apart from the very beginning. The investigation's version was based not on facts, but on rumors. Not a single witness saw the attack. All the evidence was circumstantial. The only thing that even remotely connected the arrested people to the case was some old village crockery, in which, according to the police, human blood was kept. Although the examination showed that the blood could have been from a bird, and in some cases it was just juice from berries, the defense did not give up. Lawyer Dryagin filed an appeal with the Senate. The complaint turned out to be convincing. The Senate acknowledged that the case was conducted with violations, and the accusations were based on assumptions. Everything was sent for review to another court in another city. The second trial began, this time in Elabuga. The same people, the same accusations. Again, there were stories about shamans, the evil god Kurbona who demands human hearts. Again, there was evidence. Bowls with dried stains and a witness who heard something 10 years ago from a drunken vagabond. Again, a verdict. Again, 7 people were found guilty. Again, hard labor. But the defense did not give up. The third hearing took place in May 1896. That's when everything started to go differently. The lawyers Dryagin and Korobchevsky brought not ritual legends, but dry facts into the courtroom. One of the experts, the ethnographer Vereshchagin, stated directly, the Udmurts never had a tradition of human sacrifice. Even in the oldest rituals, no such cases are described. Lawyer Korobchevsky went to Multan himself and found that very hut. He showed that the structure was too low. Not even one adult man could fit inside, let alone drag a person in there, swing an axe, burn organs, and perform a ritual. And no one at the trial could explain how bodies could even be brought into that hut. Everything seemed far-fetched. No one really examined the place where the body was found. The splinters with blood that the peasants showed to the district police officer, he irritably threw into the swamp. No one checked the logs on the path that seemed to be soaked in blood. Anything that didn't fit the already prepared version was simply dismissed. Bailiff Timofeev, the very one who was the first to handle the case, found himself in an awkward position. It turned out he had been inside the hut himself and had seen the place. But he didn't mention this in the official documents. He never explained why. Maybe he didn't think it was necessary, or maybe he didn't want to ruin a beautiful legend. The witness's testimony was inconsistent. Confessions were obtained under pressure. The evidence turned out to be meaningless. In the end, it became clear. No one was caught red-handed. The whole case was built on fantasies and rumors. And on June 4, 1896, the court delivered a verdict of not guilty. All charges, both of murder and of ritual, were found to be unfounded. The accused were released. It was a sensation. The press exploded. Journalists, writers, lawyers, dozens of people followed the trial and did not hide their opinions. Viktor Korolenko, a writer and journalist, became almost the voice of the defense. His articles exposed the absurdity of the accusation. Lawyer Conan called this case a disgrace to the investigation. Thus ended the 3-year-long persecution. People were almost sent to hard labor for a killing that may not have even happened. And even if it did happen, it definitely wasn't in the hut, and definitely not for an evil god. It turned out to be not a ritual, but ordinary human hatred, and a hunt for those who were different from the majority. When this whole story with the sacrifice began, the investigation quickly decided the terrible barbaric faith of the Vatyaks was to blame for everything. They were accused of witchcraft, of worshipping some evil god, Kurban, who supposedly needed human hearts as offerings. This idea seemed convincing only on paper, but those who really knew the Udmurts immediately understood. This was nonsense. In reality, most of the residents of Old Multan had already been baptized long ago. There was an Orthodox church in the village, services were held, children were baptized, people confessed. In village life, Orthodoxy was a part of everyday routine, just like in any Russian village. Even the local church elder was one of the same Udmurts who were accused of the crime. The priest who served in Multan even before the arrests insisted that there had never been any ritual killings in the village. If anything like that had ever happened, he would have known. The peasants came to him for confession and shared their troubles. There wasn't even a hint that anyone, anywhere, was killing people in honor of pagan gods. Yes, the Udmurts really did keep some old customs. For example, they would gather in family huts, small wooden structures, where they sometimes lit candles or sacrificed birds. During holidays, it was customary to prepare meat, which was shared with the villagers, and a portion was donated to the church. These very celebrations, where dishes made from poultry or beef were prepared, were called sacrifices. And this was no secret. Nothing happened in these huts that went beyond village superstition. Some people simply remembered their ancestors, some asked for health, sometimes they left a piece of bread, poured milk, whispered something in their own language, but it's all in the same vein as the Russian habit of placing a candy on a grave. No blood, no sacrifices, only remembrance. Lawyer Korobchevsky and writer Korolenko both said there was nothing terrible in those huts. Even during thorough searches, the police did not find any knives or tools for rituals. Nothing terrible, just old dishes with stains from chicken or berries, but the investigation didn't need to hear that. It was more convenient for them to believe in savagery and paganism. The convicted men responded to the first guilty verdict with the words, "Christ suffered and we must suffer too." The people spent almost 3 years under arrest. The oldest suspect died even before the first trial. Another accused person survived. The old man died almost immediately after being released. Only after the acquittal was the main piece of evidence found. As soon as the swamp dried up a bit, 2 local peasants went to gather moss and stumbled upon a head in the dried up bog. It appeared literally a few steps away from where the body was found, in the very same swamp where apparently it was cut off but not taken away. This fact made all suspicions collapse completely. If the head wasn't taken for a ritual, then it all comes down to plain cruelty because of a conflict between the peasants. It would seem that the discovered head should have made the police continue the investigation. After all, the culprits were never found. But something went wrong. Police official Timofeev, despite the discovery, stated, "There are no grounds, no reasons," and the case was hushed up. Meanwhile, the picture of the crime became clear. All the evidence pointed to the real culprits. Two Russian peasants from a neighboring village who had asked to move to the Udmurts' better lands but were refused, and they held a grudge. They hoped that after a big scandal, the Udmurts would be sent to hard labor from their fertile fields, and then peasants from neighboring villages could take their land. Professor of forensic medicine Feodosy Patenko soon confirmed. The killing was not a ritual, but an imitation of a ritual out of revenge for refusing to accept them into the community and give them a piece of land. But the real names of the culprits, Timofey Vasyukin and Yakov Koneshin, were only discovered 3 decades later. One of them confessed during confession. So, that's what the real story looked like. Matyunin was killed not because of a sacrifice, but because of a land dispute. They dumped the body on the molten side and threw the head into the swamp. It looked like a mystery to frame others. Voices of truth rose too late, when the whole show was already over, and yet the truth came out. More than 3 years after the life was taken, when the swamp loosened its grip, people found the head. That's all. No legends, no rituals, no mysticism, no ancient gods. Just a life taken out of malice and envy, and repentance in confession before death. The court acquitted the peasant from the old Multan, but they paid a huge price. Write what you think about this case, like or dislike, and watch other videos on the channel. They come out even though you don't always get notifications about it.